Easier just to draw these pictures instead of writing it all out. Put your iPads away. Okay, so remember these are types of polygons. Polygons are straight, no curves, they're closed, sides don't intersect. And we already did the triangles, so we're doing now the quadrilaterals. 4 sides. And we did the first special type, we did parallelograms. So, Mason, can you put that away? Just turn it over. Okay, so on a parallelogram, remember we went over this last week? Opposite sides are congruent and parallel. And opposite angles are congruent. And then also consecutive angles add up to 180. Any 2 angles in a row. Which is true because these are same side interior and so are these. And then diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so the special types of parallelograms now. There are squares, rectangles, and rhombus. So all of these are parallelograms. So that means everything true here is going to be true in these 3 things. Opposite sides are going to be congruent and parallel. Opposite angles will be the same. Any 2 angles in a row add up to 180, and the diagonals bisect each other. Okay? So a square, everyone knows what that is. All 4 corners are 90, all 4 sides are the same. The extra thing that's different from a parallelogram and a square, it has to do with the diagonals. The diagonals do bisect each other, but all 4 pieces will be the same length. So like in here, this equals that and that equals that. You can tell all 4 of these are not the same. In a square, they will all be the same. And they'll be perpendicular to each other. So there's 2 extra things in a square. Well, actually 3 because all 4 sides are the same. Okay? In a rectangle, everything is true in a parallelogram that's true here. There's really only one extra thing, is the diagonals bisect each other and they're all the same length. But they aren't going to be 90 degrees like in a square. So if you know one of them, you know the others. And in a rhombus, all 4 sides are the same, just like a square. It's like a square that's been tipped. Everything true here is true in a rhombus. The added thing is that they're all the same. And with the diagonals again, they do bisect each other. Obviously, they're not all 4 the same like these 2. You can see these 2 are shorter than these 2. But they do form a 90. Okay, so these are the things that are different. So, you guys have all done rhombuses, squares, and rectangles before. It's really nothing new. So there's not a lot of examples to go through. Of course, they throw in these always, sometimes, or never questions on these. Is a square always a rectangle?
Yeah.
No.
Or sometimes or never?
It always is.
So, if it's a square, That means all the things are true in a parallelogram, plus all four sides are equal, all four diagonals are equal, and they're perpendicular. But if it's a rectangle, is all of that, or I mean, if it's a square, does everything in here cover everything that's in a rectangle?
No, not the perpendicular.
Yeah, but remember, it's a square. Could...
Yes.
Yes. Square is the thing that has everything. Okay, so the square has all four sides equal. The diagonals are perpendicular. They're all cut into equal pieces. So a square, you could always call it a rectangle. Because everything, if you have a picture of a square and then you listed out all the stuff that a rectangle needs, it would all be in that square. Does that make sense? If they did this backwards, is a rectangle a square?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. And the only time it would be is if all four sides were the same. So you would just call it a square. Now when you're naming figures like this, if you had a square, there's many things you could call it. Square is the best. But you could call it a rectangle. You could call it a rhombus. You could call it a quadrilateral. And you could call it a polygon. And you could call it a parallelogram, right? Okay. But square is the most descriptive name. So if you had a square, you could call it any one of these things. But if you had a rhombus, it could sometimes be a square. Again, the only time it would be is if they're all 90 degrees. Is a square sometimes, always, or never a parallelogram?
Square.
Always.
Always, yes.
Squares, rhombuses, and rectangles are always. But if you go backwards, is a parallelogram sometimes, always, never a rhombus? Sometimes. Okay. Alright, so we already did all this stuff. So again, they tell us it's a rectangle. So what do you got to do to figure out what that angle is? It's got to equal 90 since it's a rectangle. So we just subtract 6, divide by 7, and that is 12. Okay, sometimes, always, never. We already went through these. Could a rhombus be called a square?
Yeah. Only if it has.
Sometimes, yep. Is a parallelogram a rectangle? Sometimes.
Yes, sometimes.
If they did this backwards, a square is always a rhombus, a rectangle is always a parallelogram. So since this is a square, what do you know about that and that?
They're equal.
They're equal because they're sides. 13 minus 6x has to equal x plus 27. So if I move the 6x over, I got to add it. So get this 27 out of there. It's a plus, so minus. Then divide by 7 and you get negative 2. Okay, so, oh, I did forget to add one thing in a rhombus. The diagonals not only bisect each other, they bisect each angle. Okay, so if this was a 120 degree angle, that'd be 60 and that'd be 60.
Okay.
And if this was 120, that means this whole angle would be 60, which means these would each be 30. Okay? A square also, they get bisected. So when you draw a diagonal, what would each angle make?
45.
45, 45, yep. So, to make the base, the floor, you nail 4 pieces of wood together as shown. What is the shape of this? Okay, we don't know it's a square though, because we don't know if they're all 90. But we could call this for sure a parallelogram, or better yet, a rhombus. because they're all four the same. Do you know how they check? How carpenters check to make sure something's square? There's two things they can do. The what? Well, yeah, you guys put your iPads away. Pythagorean theorem is one way. If you draw a right triangle, you take 8 squared plus 8 squared, and then square root it. That'll tell you what this is supposed to be. Another way they do it is a very common triangle. It depends on how big you want. Is a 6, 8, 10. Is they'll just measure out 8 on one side and 6 on another, and then make sure that's 10. If it is, they know that's a 90. But if it's something small like that, they just measure the diagonals. This diagonal would have to be equal to that one in order for them to be a square. So here it says both diagonals are 11,4, so it is a square, yes. Okay, true or false? The diagonals of a rhombus are always congruent.
Always true.
No, these are just true or false. It could be, it would be sometimes. So are they always congruent?
No.
False. Diagonals of a square are never perpendicular?
False.
False, they're always perpendicular. Each diagonal of a rectangle sometimes bisects a pair of opposite angles. So if it's a regular rectangle, does it look like the angle's being bisected? Cut in half? Let me make a better rectangle then. No, they're not. But the key here is it says sometimes. So remember, you could have a square and then it would be bisected. So that's the key there. That's why these sometimes, always, never are so difficult to figure out sometimes. So this would be true because it would bisect it if that rectangle was actually a square.